Special counsel Bob Mueller has finished his Russia investigation late today. He filed his formal report with the Justice Department, which announced this news at 5 p.m. Eastern on March 22nd, a day that history will mark as the end of a significant probe and the beginning of a pitched battle over who will see Bob Mueller's findings and what, if anything, to do about them. Here are the facts. Attorney General Bill Barr notifying Congress with this letter you see right here, brand new. It states that the DOJ never overruled Mueller on any big calls like who to indict, and states Barr may be in a position to advise Congress of Bob Mueller's principal conclusions about those indictments and who he did not indict as soon as this weekend. As soon as this weekend. So there is a lot to get to. I have a big panel and a lot of experts, and Chuck and Nicole waiting. But I go first to a newsmaker. The intelligence chairman in the House, Adam Schiff, joins us by phone for his first reaction. Good evening, sir. I'm waiting to see if I can hear Chairman Schiff on the phone.
Ari, I can hear you.
Great. Thank you. I hear you now, Chairman. Our viewers can hear you. Your reaction to tonight's news.
Well, we've been waiting for that puff of smoke above the Justice Department and finally got it today that the special counsel has concluded his investigation. The key question, though, is will Bill Barr live up to the commitment that he made to be as transparent as possible, which would require making public the Mueller report. We voted overwhelmingly in the House to do that. But for Lindsey Graham's stopping that bill in the Senate, I think the Senate would have voted overwhelmingly to make the Mueller report public as well. But one thing I will add, Ari, is the report itself, as important as that will be, is not as important as the underlying evidence. And in particular, of concern to us in the Intelligence Committee, any evidence of compromise, whether it was criminal or not, any evidence that a U.S. person, the president, or anyone around him may be acting in the foreign interest of an adversary and not in the interest of our country.
So, Mr. Chairman, as you know, this letter was directed to Congress. You are one of the decision makers reacting to it. I understand you to be referring to the two pieces here. One, that by this weekend, Bill Barr says he could basically refer to you his view of Bob Mueller's principal conclusions. And that number two, he says in the time ahead, he will consult with Mueller and Rosenstein about what other information can be released to both you, the Congress, and the public. Now that we know that's the stance they take, what is your view, Mr. Chairman, of what must be in that other second bucket of other information?
So it's important for people to know that what Mueller is reporting, as best we can tell, are his conclusions on the criminal side of the House, who should be indicted and who shouldn't be indicted and why he reached those conclusions. But let's remember this began as a counterintelligence investigation as to whether any U.S. persons were acting as agents of a foreign power. And that information may be of the greatest consequence to the country because it would shed light on whether U.S. policy is being distorted for financial or other reasons. And that is the information that I think absolutely must be shared with the Congress and ultimately made public. In fact, there is a statutory obligation to inform the intelligence committees of any significant intelligence activity, including counterintelligence. So we're fully going to expect that that's what the department is going to do, and if we need to compel them to do so, we will. But we need to know at the end of the day that the president is acting out of the country's interest and not because he wants to build a tower in Moscow or for any other illicit purpose.
Chairman Adam Schiff has joined us here in our live coverage of the breaking news that the Mueller report has been filed 5 p.m. Eastern tonight, and everyone making sense of what comes next. On that, Chairman, before I let you go, I also want to ask you, when you look at the record, now we can mark today as the end of Bob Mueller's actual investigation. You, Congress, and a lot of other people can react to what he found, but I want to go over with you before I let you go what he's done now. 37 indictments, 6 former advisors to Donald Trump, many of them accused of things that relate to activities that were taken, they say, on behalf of Donald Trump, his lawyer, campaign activities, national security, lying to the FBI. If this is the end, do you view tonight's news as an indication there are no other potentially sealed or remaining indictments that we would learn about? And what does it mean, in your view, that Bob Mueller has this record of 37 indictments and finished his probe today?
Well, what it means is that the Office of the Special Counsel, which is essentially a contract attorney to the Justice Department, that office won't be bringing any further indictments. It doesn't mean, of course, that Maine Justice or the Southern District of New York U.S. Attorney's Office or the Eastern District or others may not bring indictments. In fact, given the lengthy redactions in many of the pleadings of the special counsel alluding to other investigations, I think it's entirely possible, if not likely, that there will be other indictments. Now, how central or peripheral they'll be to the core issues of potential conspiracy is yet to be determined. But in terms of the special counsel's record, I think it's one that, by historic standards, in terms of the swiftness of the conduct investigation, the number of people close to the president that were indicted and convicted, the number of Russians indicted, the specificity of the information given about Russia's interference in our election, it's a signal accomplishment for any team of prosecutors.
Chairman Schiff, I trust you'll be busy, especially over this weekend, given that the Attorney General says he may be briefing you and your colleagues as soon as this weekend. I thank you for calling in to The Beat tonight with your first reaction. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.